we're going to look at an example of a portfolio, and this part is focusing on row A of the rubric, which is inquiry. That section is scored in the exact same way for both 2D and drawing. So even though this is a specific example from 2D, you're held to the exact same standards. So we're going to go through what the student did and the response, the feedback from the scores at the College Board. I also want to note this feedback that we get from the College Board, these examples, you will not receive that in your own portfolio. They only do this for a select few portfolios for training purposes. So row A about inquiry is telling us that, I'm actually just going to open it up for a second. So row A at a 3 asked us for written evidence that identifies an inquiry that guides the sustained investigation and visual evidence that demonstrates the sustained investigation, remembering that they're looking at your whole body of work. So this response right here, you will have a larger section to write about your work, your whole body of your work when you submit your portfolio. So this is what the student wrote about their whole body of work. How can I introduce transgender lives and culture to my community and my art? I wanted to introduce the struggles, oppressions, and culture behind trans and LGBTQ culture into my conservative and closed-minded community. To do this, I made works that engage with the audience with bright colors, clear dark lines, and simplified figures to create an image that explained aspects of transgender culture. My sustained investigation took a great deal of time. I filled 5 sketchbooks while making pieces for my portfolio. The composition of each piece was a constant process of revision. Elements started as separate entities as I experimented with materials like magazines, tissue paper, and inks. So you will see some of the words reflected back from the rubric, like revision. We know revision is an important thing. We know experimentation and practice are important. So the student did a really good job of using those exact words in their writing to make a really clear connection. These numbers are indicating what they feel are strong examples, strong evidence of that within their work. I began to introduce the use of simplification into my works. In image 12, flamboyance was an important tone I wanted my portfolio to have. So they're saying that they show that in image 1, 5, 7, and 11. I explored histories of fashion and culture that reflected flamboyancy, mainly in the Rococo and Elizabethan periods in images 4, 11, and 13. And their influence on the fashion movement, camp, which was documented in the 1966 essay by Susan Sontag and Assel in the 1980s. Trans people in history was an aspect I researched, which we can see in image 8, and I wanted to show their suppression and accomplishments. So now we're going to move on to looking at the individual works. I want you to remember that the focus of this, so how this particular part is scored, is focusing on the inquiry, which is the connection between the written and visual evidence. This is an example of what you are able to write about each individual digital image that you submit. So here we have that this piece is 20 by 10 inches. Materials are watercolor, and the student told us a little bit why they selected those materials. Softness and texture to the figure, India ink to create texture, boldness for the figure. And the process, the neck length, torsion, stretching shows desperation. Apple represents education, and bright colors show hope. So you can see this student is really working on telling us in their writing why they made the choices that they made and how those choices connect to their inquiry. Image number 2, materials, micro pen to show thin, precise lines, a dip pen to show line variation, texture, watercolor, to make it transparent and bright. Our process, the heads show multiple gender identities within one person, and the clothing shows creativity and flamboyancy. So this is what I've been talking about. We want the process to tell us more. Why did you make the decisions that you made? And moving away from things like, I made a sketch, then I added color, then I added collage. Telling us why did you put what you put on the page, and why did you choose the materials that you chose to put onto the page. Image number 3, materials are watercolor to concentrate the background, traditional media. The magazine, more intrusive abstract figures. Process, the museum in the background shows traditional displays. Big figures in the center show a sudden intro of trans history. Image 4, this is an example of a process image. So we're seeing things from the student's sketchbook, helping us to understand what was the inquiry, what was the exploration, the experimentation. We're seeing watercolor. This was easy in variation and value while maintaining a traditional quality. Graphite, traditional value. Processes. Anatomy allowed me to easily simplify my characters. Focusing on Rococo and Renaissance history honed the technique. You can see that they're also shortening words to try and fit into the 100 character limit. Image 5. Our materials are micron pen. It gives detailed designs and structure. Sharpie is used for shadow, attention to the center, and watercolor to get more of these pastels. Processes, the tall figures show poise and attention to detail in older trans people and how they mentor the smaller figure. So here they're using scale to help talk about relationships. In image 6, this is another example of a process image. Watercolor for tone and value, micro pen, lines, structure, texture, and pencil for tone. Processes, studying historical dress and architecture, allowed me to better understand androgyny over time. Image 7, we have acrylic for bright blocked tones, India ink simplified structures, tissue paper for texture, and cardboard for height. Processes, the landscape is made from the bodies, the figures and background is meant to show abandon and freedom. Image 8, another process image. This is India ink, was used because it is bold, watercolor for color blocking and value, tissue paper to create texture, color, and graphite for the sketch. Processes. I worked with various materials and techniques to make my projects more expressive, creating tone. Here we see India ink for bold lines and value, acrylic paint for consistent tone, and cardboard to add texture and height. So we have some raised surfaces going on in this piece. Process, symmetrical figure representation. It represents fear, dysphoria, social stigma, and the figures are bound and under control of the center figure. Image 10. We have watercolor allowed me to create interesting layered textures while maintaining a solid structure. Processes. Homunculus and heads show the separation of mind and body. Scaffolding shows gentrification and binaries. Image 11. Watercolor, bright colors, clean blending, transparency, acrylic, India ink, cardboard, and tissue paper. Processes, we're seeing the separation of the head shows selective stigma towards trans people. The emphasis of one outshines the other. In image 12, our materials are watercolor for bold colors and transparency in figure. The India ink gives us attention to the central figure. Processes, large, exaggerated proportions allow the audience to make assumptions about the figure. And they most likely make unwarranted assumptions. Image 13 is another process image. Here we have watercolor, tone, color, value. India ink brings value, tones, adds heavy lines to bring a cartoonist quality. Processes, we see abstraction studies, let me work on gaining a feeling of stretching and comfort for my figures. Image 14. We have micron pen, detailing design, India ink, bold contrast, watercolor detail, and color detail. Processes, the hands from the viewer, the heads show reaching ideas, Elizabethan dress to theater, and laughing faces show the audience. And our last image for image 15. India ink shadows distance, watercolor, transparency, brightness, and texture. Processes, we have a dismembered body, shows changes wanted by trans people with dysphoria and the search for chemical change. So let's learn a little bit more about the score. So this body of work, this sustained investigation in row A of the rubric scored a 3. So each row is scored separately on the rubric. So here it scored a 3. Let's get a little bit of a better understanding of why it scored a 3 under written evidence identifies an inquiry that guides the sustained investigation, and visual evidence demonstrates the sustained investigation. So this is feedback from the scorers. In this portfolio, the written and visual evidence to introduce transgender lives and culture to my community with my art guides the sustained investigation. Seeking, searching, and discovering are evident in the process, materials, ideas, visual components, and written information throughout the works. For example, in the written evidence, the artist states, I filled 5 sketchbooks while making pieces for my portfolio. The composition of each piece was a constant process of revision. Therefore, the sustained investigation in this portfolio also contains visual evidence guided by an identified written inquiry. The confident use of color and line throughout the visual evidence demonstrates the sustained investigation and establishes connections from one image to the next in the body of work. Likewise, the written evidence for each image guides the inquiry and provides the viewer with physical and conceptual materials and processes of making. For example, in image 1, the artist states, watercolor for softness and texture to the figure, India ink, texture, boldness for figure, neck length, torsion, stretching, shows desperation. This inquiry presents written and visual evidence of exploration of the Rococo and Elizabethan periods through the study of fashion and culture in images 6 and 14. Flamboyance was an important tone I wanted my portfolio to have in images 1, 2, 5, 7, and 11. The artist demonstrates how research and practice in the sketchbook, studying historical dress and architecture, allowed me to better understand androgyny over time, which guides the investigation. The relationships established between images and written statements in this portfolio show high levels of development and guide the viewer through the sustained investigation.